Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Mary Beth Gassman and I am a professor at Rutgers University. I also have the pleasure of serving as the executive director for both the Samuel DeWitt Proctor Institute for Leadership, Equity, and Justice and the Rutgers Center for Minority Serving Institutions, which are the two entities that are sponsoring today's event. I just wanted to mention that we have two wonderful people doing tech today, Giselle and Natalie, who will be working with us, and want to tell you a little bit about this series that we have, because we have several talks every year, and it is called Let's Talk About the Humanities, and it is sponsored by the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, which we are really, really grateful for their support. It's part of a larger program that is called Hispanic Serving Institutions Pathways to the Professoriate. And our speaker today is a faculty member at a Hispanic Serving Institution, the University of Texas at El Paso. And so we are very excited about this program because it allows us to bring wonderful humanities-based talks to a larger audience. So I want to introduce our speaker, who is someone that I really admire, and I met back in 2015 when he was a fellow for a program that we have at the Rutgers Center for Minority Serving Institutions, which is called Elevate. It's an early career faculty program, and Ignacio Martinez was one of the fellows in the inaugural cohort, and we are coming up, I think, on our 9th year of Elevate. So stay tuned. If you follow us on Twitter, you can get the information on how, if you're interested in being a fellow, you could become a fellow. So Ignacio Martinez is an associate professor of history, specializing in the history of colonial Latin America. And he received his BA and MA degrees from the University of New Mexico and his PhD from the University of Arizona. Ignacio's research and scholarly interests include the Atlantic world, the social and intellectual history of colonial Mexico, the Spanish borderlands, and the history of emotions. His first book, titled The Intimate Frontier, Friendship, Civil Society in Northern New Spain, was published in 2019 by the University of Arizona Press, and it looks at the role of friendship in the social and intellectual construction of frontier society. In his book, he argues that the ideals, rhetoric, logic, and emotions of friendship played an important role in the multi-layered lives of frontier Indians, Spaniards, and mixed-race people. His second book project, which is currently in its initial stages, takes a broader methodological approach in analyzing how ideas about friendship matured and circulated through the Atlantic world. So I want to welcome Ignacio Martinez for his talk, The Hispanic World from Creole Patriotism to Chicano Nationalism. Welcome, and I'm really looking forward to hearing from you. And we will have a big, lots of time at the end for Q&A. So make sure and put your questions in the Q&A because we'd love to hear from you. All right, take it away.
Thank you very much, Mary Beth. I'd like to start by by thanking Mary Beth, Natalie, and the entire team at the Center for Minority Serving Institutions for opening up to me this wonderful venue to talk to you all today about my current book project, which is very tentatively titled The Hispanic World from Creole Patriotism to Chicano Nationalism. Although I think a better subtitle and kind of the direction that I'm more headed towards would be The Hispanic World, the intellectual history of the Spanish legacy in the New World. I like the first title because it's provocative, but I think the second title is more accurate as to what I'm doing. This is a book that I've been wanting to write for a very long time now, essentially since I was an undergraduate at the University of New Mexico. But I never really knew how to approach this complex topic, which felt to me was littered with numerous dead ends and not a few landmines. But that's partly why I wanted to write it now. At this stage in my career, to challenge myself, but really to figure out a way around some of these enduring conundrums, which I think in this context for this topic is the right word. I do think that the Spanish legacy really is a sort of a riddle. I also knew that a great deal of scholarship has already been done on Spain's presence in the New World. by well-known and renowned scholars. In fact, most recently I came across a fascinating book by one of those renowned scholars, Richard Kagan, titled "The Spanish Craze, America's Fascination with the Hispanic World." You know, when you come across books like this, there's always a little bit of trepidation because you're always hoping and praying that they aren't already saying something that you want to say. I also know, and a few colleagues have reminded me of this, and they're right, that the Spanish legacy is kind of old news. It's not really cutting edge scholarship per se. There's a lot of really good stuff being done on indigenous slavery, indigenous frontiers, indigenous knowledge making. All this is true. But what I hope to do with this project is precisely to find the middle ground, a space where both methodologies can come together, can unite. And maybe in the process, I can provide some new insights, some updates, a fresh perspective, and maybe, and this is the hope, produce something unique in the process. So next slide. An important question that emerges right off the bat is this: who is this book for? Who am I writing this book for? This is a question that has really kind of plagued me and kind of gnawed at me. But I think it's an important question. And I think the book is for those who are struggling to where to find, where to place Spain in their identities. Where do I put this problematic part of my history? I think I want to spend some time in the introduction to the book addressing this point because I think it's an important one. So as Mary Beth noted, I got my PhD in colonial Latin American history at the University of Arizona. Although I will say that my interests have always primarily been on Chicano identity. This is one of the main reasons why I became a historian in the first place. And I became a colonialist specifically because I felt that historians of Chicano history didn't go back far enough in time and in scope to adequately address the complexities of Chicano identity. That's the way I felt. Interestingly, when I was looking back at the previous talks in this Humanities series, I came across Professor Geraldo Cadava's synopsis for his talk. And the first sentence of his overview to his talk posed this very question: does it make sense to consider the Spanish colonial period as a part of Latino history? After my initial panic wore off, thinking, well, shoot, this is my entire shtick, I realized that in fact, the very posing of this question suggests that this is still a question that needs intellectual development and scholarly articulation. Now, I didn't attend the talk, nor was I able to find it online, but after the beads of sweat dried from my forehead, I was certain that the answer, at least for me, was a resolute yes. The colonial period, I firmly believe, is integral to Latino identity. And it's through the Spanish legacy, I believe, which is inseparable from Latino identity, that we can ascertain the importance of this history. But let me go back a little bit to the writing of my first book. My first book dealt with notions of friendship in colonial Sonora, what it meant, how it was used, how it was abused, manipulated, feigned, performed, specifically how friendship was used in a colonial borderlands context, and what that meant for the origins of a nascent form of civil society. And as is the case with most first books during the early stages of one's career, it was based largely off of my dissertation research. At times, writing this book was fun, but mostly it was nerve-wracking, largely because not much had been done on the topic. So there was no guide rails, so to speak, for me to use, which is very different from this current project on which a great deal has already been done. So the contrast between rummaging around in the dark, which is how I felt writing the first book, and trying to find new space to explore under the bright lights, which is how I'm approaching this book, presents an interesting methodological frame for me. In the end, I can't say that I was entirely happy with the outcome of my first book. As many in the audience know, when you get a tenure track job, you generally have 5 or so years to write a book for tenure, at least in my field. And so I was really under the gun to write. And the problem was that I was having a hard time finding the motivation to do that. I was kind of tired of the topic after having spent several years dissertating on it, and I kind of felt trapped by it. And so it took me a while to get going. But by the time that I rediscovered my enthusiasm for my first project, it was too late to innovate. I just had to write and submit. You know, I think there is something, and I don't want to say wrong, I think there's something unnatural, perhaps counterproductive in the way tenure works in this way. but that's a discussion for another talk. So initially I was thinking that my second book project would be a larger analysis of friendship in the Atlantic world. That was my intent, and I still want to write that book. But when Mary Beth asked me to give this talk last spring, I began thinking about the second project, how I would lay out the second project, this project on friendship in the Atlantic world. And I just wasn't into it. I kept thinking about the future project, the one that I would love to do one day, this current project. And then one day over the summer, it just dawned on me, why am I waiting? Just do it. I already have tenure. Just write this book. It was one of those rare moments of just absolute clarity and certainty. This is what I was going to do. And so I began the process. Okay, so what do I do? Where do I start? This is always one of the toughest parts of any project, right? Is starting a project and ending a project. I had written a master's thesis, seems like forever ago, on a related topic. The topic was the intellectual movement of Hispanismo in the 19th and 20th centuries in Latin America. And so there was my starting point, to revise and maybe revisit and revise some of the work that I had already done. Except the problem was that my master's thesis was on a 3.5-inch floppy drive, and I couldn't find anywhere to download it. So I began the painstaking process of retyping relevant portions of the project, areas that I felt that I could use, long section passages, things of that nature. Until one day, I guess my 13-year-old daughter saw me suffering, typing this stuff away, and she offered to help. And she asked me to drive her to the public library, where she proceeded to scan my bound master's thesis, turn that into a PDF, and then turn that PDF into a Word document. And voila, there it was. This is how technologically illiterate that I am. That possibility never even crossed my mind that could be done. So I was incredibly grateful for that. All right, so I was off and running. I'm fully committed to writing this book, a book that I wanted to write on a topic that speaks to me, that motivates me, that scares me a little bit, but I think that's a good thing, right? I think you should be a little bit cautious when entering established territory, especially territory that others have already reconnoitered, because at some point along that journey, you might have to question or disagree with some of their findings, and that can be daunting. In my mind, it's almost akin to challenging someone to a fight. Well, that might be a bit overstated, but the point is that I'm going to challenge previous work, and if I'm going to do that, I have to absolutely know what I'm talking about in the first place, and then it's imperative that I have something new and original, and maybe even a little provocative to say. So I decided that if I was going to do this right, I had to immerse myself in this topic. And as many of you in the audience may know, when you have the motivation and the enthusiasm for something, you have to ride that wave until you get to shore. And I'm on that wave right now. So I decided to organize my readings and my courses in such a way that I would fully be immersed in this topic for the next 2 to 3 years as I write this thing. And that's kind of the time frame that I've given myself, 2 to 3 years, maybe 4 if I have to go that long, but that's the time frame I'm working with. I decided to teach a graduate class this coming spring on this very issue. The title of the class is Spain as a Global Empire, the History, Memory, and Legacy of the Spanish World. All the books selected for this course are books that are generally not for the class, but are also directly relevant to this project. I'd always known professors who had done this, who had organized their courses around their book projects. But I always felt guilty about doing that. I felt like I was putting my own interests ahead of the interests of my students. But I think that's the wrong way of looking at this, especially for early career professors who need to find ways to advance their own research while also helping their students navigate these complex historical methodologies. And what better way to do that than to work on this endeavor together? I'm also currently teaching an undergraduate course on colonial Mexico. And I did something in this course that I've never done before. I did an entire section, 3 weeks on Spain. After the section, we did another section, 2 weeks on the Spanish conquest. And then I had my undergraduate students write a reflection paper, which had this question as their prompt. Analyze and reflect on the complex legacy of conquest in the New World, provide a reasoned argument for how the Spanish presence in the New World should be approached, framed, and ultimately studied in 2022. Next slide. So the goal here was to utilize my students, their interests, their concerns, their objections, their insights, to orient my own research. And here are some of the responses, and I think they're quite telling. This is something that came up various times throughout the responses. How to strike the right balance between a cold, rational perspective and one that perhaps over-emotionalizes the past. This, I think, is right on. But again, the problem is, how do we do that? Here are just two of the responses that I'd like to just read really quickly. See if I can get, let's see here. So one of them was, viewing the Spanish conquest only through an emotional lens, only through an emotional attitude can cloud your analysis. However, studying the Spanish conquest from only a rational perspective takes away the humanity in history. Yet it is unrealistic to view past events, specifically the Spanish conquest, from a modern moral perspective. This is one of my Latina students. Emotionalism is one of the best ways to interest people in history. Through personal connections to the past, they find connection with their ancestors. Rationality is the framework by which we gain the most accurate picture of history. The issue arises when emotionalism goes so far as to label certain topics beyond discussion. And then the last one, history to me is one of the most interesting things you can study, simply because there is no outcome needed. No one is the victor because everyone gets to decide whom they deem worthy of such a title. It is a curiosity-based field, or as my father likes to call historian, this is really great, professional gossipers, which is right on the money. Sure, you can bring your own opinion into it and advocate for a certain side, but then someone else will advocate for the other, and you're forced to readjust your standpoint. And the ultimate prize, to bask in the Enlightenment, which is why I argue that no side should be taken, or rather, of the two sides, the third side should be taking that of knowledge. So another concern that came up in these, or another concern that came up from my students was the notion of presentism. It's something that students are struggling with. I'm struggling with. You know, how do you deal with presentism, right? This is a tough question that I think requires careful maneuvering. And it comes up a lot when addressing the Spanish legacy, right? Events in the past cannot be judged by a modern moral lens. I don't really know how to engage with this issue, since I'm not entirely clear on the boundaries of the debate. But I know that I'm going to have to engage with this issue in the book for sure. So I'll have to read up on this and explore innovative ways to approach this. So this project is still in its infancy. It's still in its initial reading. I'll emphasize that, still in its initial reading and research phase. And to a large extent, it's still trying to figure out what it wants to be. And I think the input from my graduate students and my undergraduate students will really play a large role in how I lay out the book. And so I'm really excited about that. At the moment, over the summer in which I was contemplating how to address this topic, Oñate High School in Las Cruces, named after one of the conquistadores, colonizers, and founders of New Mexico, was being renamed Oregon Mountain High. Dorm rooms named after some of these early conquistadores, these Spaniards at the University of New Mexico, were being debated whether they should be renamed or not. Same thing for street signs and parks all across the Southwest. This is in reality an old debate that stretches back several decades. But now, as I saw it in the summer of 2022, it seemed to be happening with increasing speed, which very much piqued my interest. You know, the murder of George Floyd, the removal of Confederate statues, the spread of white nationalism, all these events really seem to reinvigorate the debate about how nations dealt with the evils of the past. In fact, there was a great issue of Foreign Affairs that came out around 2018, 2019, titled exactly that. It was titled "The Undead Past: How Nations Confront the Evils of History." And present in the issue were Germany, China, Russia, South Africa, Rwanda, and a few others, but not Spain. Spain was curiously absent from the issue, possibly because I think, and this is something that I'm going to address in the book, it's not doing a very good job of dealing with its imperial past. Nevertheless, it seemed to me, at least, that there was a concerted effort on either eliminating the Spanish past or grasping at straws to try to justify it, which in both cases made me cringe. And it was shocking how far apart these two sides really were. So for me, the main question was this. How is the dialogue about dealing with the injustices of the past being framed and debated by intellectuals, by scholars, by community members, by the left, by the right, by men, by women, by indigenous peoples, by Hispanics? This question plagued me because it seemed like there were various competing sides to this debate. The university and the community sometimes agreed, but then often they were at odds with each other. It wasn't that they were diametrically opposed to one another, they just framed the debate differently. Hispanistas and indigenistas elaborated their sides eloquently, but rarely sought common ground. There was also a very pronounced elite versus non-elite component to this as well. Next slide. And then at times, and this is the part that really disturbed me the most, it didn't even seem like a debate or discussion at all, but rather a litmus test of values and beliefs along the same trajectory as the vaccine. If you support the Spanish past, you were probably conservative and you identified as Hispanic. If you supported the removal of references to Imperial Spain, you were probably on the left and you claimed a Chicano or Latinx identity. So here are two events that took place on October 12th or around October 12th. Some of these events took place on the weekend of that week. Again, October 12th being the symbolic day when Columbus arrived in the New World, which was, by the way, officially designated El Día de la Raza in 1918, again, to promote this transatlantic spiritual biological unity. And so as you can see here, one event, the event on the left, celebrated all things indigenous. The other celebrated all things Spanish. And even though these two groups are related, they're cousins, and as some people say they're brothers, they don't really speak to each other. And so I think this frames the central problem of what I'm interested in researching and writing. How do we get to the point where these estranged cousins can talk, can discuss, maybe debate and make amends? But before we get there, and this is the central point of the first half of the book, we have to look back at the literary and political history of this relationship, starting in the early colonial period and stretching into the 21st century. Part of the discussion here is to determine the extent, I think next slide. Part of the discussion here is to determine the extent of the Hispanic world, right? So what are the boundaries of this imaginary world? What do we mean when we say the Hispanic world? How useful is this term and what are its limits? So I want to really address that in the book as well. There's an effort underway today by many scholars to decenter European ways of knowing, which has historically been seen as the right way of doing knowledge. And this goes back all the way to the 18th century to the scholarship of men like Cornelius de Paul, Francois Reynal, William Robertson, who saw a problem with using indigenous sources to write accurate, quote, civilized history. However, these contemporary scholars, they're decentering European epistemologies of knowledge, and in their stead, they're centering subaltern and indigenous epistemologies. I think this is great. It's important, and I think it's extremely interesting. But I'm not sure it fixes the problem of context and understanding. And in fact, I feel that it exacerbates this ideological division, particularly within the Hispanic community. But I'm not quite sure how to engage with that quite yet. Still, and I think this, I'll talk more about this at the end. There are some very interesting efforts by some very innovative scholars to attempt to deal with this problem, to engage with this problem, the problem of Spain's imperial legacy and what it means for us today. How successful they've been or how successful they will be, for me, is still a question that needs deep analysis. But I think I want to end the book by looking at this issue and perhaps putting forth my ideas on how to move forward. What's the path forward on this? The central question here being, what is the proper way of celebrating, of acknowledging, of engaging with the Spanish past? So as of now, I'm structuring the book around three main problems or questions. Next slide. All right, so the first question one that I have, what role have intellectuals from the colonial period to the present played in the process of reapproachment and villainization of Spain? How have intellectuals shaped the debates around the Spanish legacy? This question here is the core of my book. It's the most important section that framed the remainder of the book. And I think it's one that absolutely needs to frame the contours of this debate if we're to have any kind of solutions. Oftentimes you have scholars who present solutions, but can't articulate the contours of this all-important debate or deem it unimportant, which I think is a serious mistake. I think that's wrong. So here in the first section, what I would like to do is I would like to look at Spanish, Latin American, particularly Mexican, indigenous, Chicano, and Mexican American intellectuals to see what they've said about the connections to Spain. So essentially, it's an intellectual survey of their writings. And as I've noted, much has already been said, but I want to reread, reinterpret, and principally include, as I mentioned, Chicano and indigenous voices into this discussion. And I think at the center here for Chicanos, particularly, will be the issues of identity, which I think will be a little bit different than those issues faced in other parts of Latin America. So I'll have to make those distinctions in the book. So for the talk, I won't address the long historiography of the rapprochement or villainization part, although this is one of the core things, the core sections of this book, namely the ways in which intellectuals engaged either with the Black or the white legend. Suffice to say that in this section, I'll spend a good amount of time and space outlining the debates surrounding Hispanismo, also known as Hispano-Americanismo in Spain, or the idea that Spaniards and Spanish Americans, Mexicans, Peruvians, Argentinians, and so on, were essentially one people, right? They made up a unified raza, endowed with this kind of a unique set of characteristics or traits. Now, the origins of Hispanismo emerged from the depression and the psychological pain that Spaniards felt in the aftermath of 1898. This generation of Spaniards, members of the so-called Generación del 98, generation of 98, men like Miguel de Unamuno and Ramiro de Maeztu, they wanted to remain relevant. They knew that they were no longer the political leaders of the Hispanic world, but they wanted to remain the spiritual leaders of this transatlantic community by connecting back to their former colonies and reaffirming their common culture, their spirit. But again, in this reformulation, Spain remained the leader of the spiritual community. This is, when all is said and done, one of the reasons why Hispanismo failed. Its vision of an Hispanic raza just couldn't let Latin Americans take the lead, let alone make enough space for America's indigenous and African elements, components that differentiate Spanish America markedly from Spain. So I'm not going to frame the parameters of that debate today, though it's an important and fascinating one. Instead, I want to talk a little bit about a complex issue that really, at some level, terrifies me about this project. But I think it's important in bringing the discussion of Hispanismo full circle to Chicanos in the Southwest. Let me start by conveying a story here that I think will frame this portion of the chapter. This story comes to us from Ilan Stavans, professor of Latin America and Latino culture at Amherst College. Stavans relays this fascinating episode that I think is integral to comprehending the connection between Spain and Chicano identity. So in 1993, when Stavans was editing his book, next slide, please, was editing his book, Growing Up Latino. The initial title for the book was Growing Up Hispanic. But this use of the term Hispanic upset several of the contributors to the volume who opposed the use of the word. In fact, these very well-known scholars, Gloria Alzaldúa and Sandra Cisneros, they refused to take part in the book project if it retained the term Hispanic in the title. Alternatives, such as Growing Up Latina or Growing Up Mestiza, and other replacements were offered. But ultimately, the consensus became that they needed to embrace the most neutral, politically correct word, which in this case, at this time, was Latino. But as Stavans noted, and I think rightly so, there's not a whole lot Latin in Latin America. But Hispanic, as many academics have pointed out, is both a term that evokes government imposition, but also provides a nod to Spain, which after all was named Hispania during the Roman occupation of the peninsula. And it's this latter point that I think reflects why so many intellectuals, at least, oppose the term Hispanic, its connection to whiteness, to Europe, and to an imperial past. This was interesting to me because I had been part of a similar struggle several years ago at the University of New Mexico, when there was an effort to rename the Chicano Studies program because of low enrollments in the courses. And the first name change reflected the complexity of this entire discussion. The program was renamed the Department of Chicano, Hispano-Mexicano Studies, and their website sought to reach out to Latino students. So all the bases were covered here. But the title was supremely unsatisfying for everyone. Nobody really liked it. Later, the program was renamed the Southwest Hispanic Studies Program. Nobody liked that either. And then not long after that, it was brought back to the Chicana/O Studies Program. The question for me was this: why was all this necessary? All these terms seemed interchangeable to some extent, and quite honestly, they were confusing. They were confusing to me. But if they were interchangeable, why was it that there was such animosity towards the term Hispanic? In some venues, but not in others, by some scholars, but not others. The term Hispano was fine, but not Hispanic. One person wrote an op-ed in the Daily Lobo in, I believe it was 2006, in relation to the original name change. And they noted, quote, "Many Mexican Americans, including many in New Mexico, reject the term Hispanic as it does not reflect the mestizaje, the mixing of race and culture of Mexican and other Latin American societies, which are composed of not only Spanish, but also indigenous and African heritages." I'm not sure that Hispanic rejects this crucial part of identities. It may be for a few, maybe in northern New Mexico or certain parts of the country, but I'm just not sure that's the case. I'll have to do more research on this and really investigate this, but I'm not convinced of that. However, this comment struck me as it closely reflected many of the comments that I had received from my undergraduate students about their own identities. Now, some noted that the very word Hispanic had imperialistic overtones. Others claimed that it denied our multicultural and multilingual past in America. This is to say nothing of the term Hispanic America or Spanish America or even Latin America. Anyways, I find it unavoidable. I'll have to go down this rabbit hole of identities. I just hope I figure out a way out of this labyrinth and I don't get stuck here. And I don't mean to be sarcastic here. It's just such a daunting task as I see it. But the term Latino, also has had its dissuaders early on, particularly in Latin America. Intellectuals such as Borges, Alfonso Reyes, Pedro Henriquez Ureña, they never really liked the term Latin America. Ureña, in fact, preferred the term La América Hispana and La América Portuguesa. But by mid-century, you had figures like Octavio Paz, Gabriel Garcia Marquez, Julio Cortázar, Mario Vargas Llosa, who didn't find it problematic anymore. But alternatives continue to proliferate, right? In his book, The Buried Mirror in 1992, Carlos Fuentes suggested the term Indo-Afro-Iberoamerica, which Stavans noted was quite a mouthful and rather impractical. In New Mexico, the great Chicano leader, Reyes López Tijerina, promoted the idea of Indo-Hispanos. Gloria Saldívar, as I mentioned earlier, favored the term mestiza. And there are more I'm sure I'll have to engage with. So without getting too far into the weeds here, my goal in this chapter that I'll devote to identity will look at how scholars utilize names, chiefly Hispano and Latino, or Hispanic and Latino, in engaging with or rejecting Spain. And I think it's really important in understanding the Spanish legacy if, as I understand it currently, avoiding the Hispanic moniker is tied in with the rejection of Spain or of whiteness or of Eurocentrism. I may have it wrong. I don't know, but it's a point that I feel needs addressing. Next slide. So the second question that I want to address, over the course of Spain's 300-year history on the American continent, how has the legacy, the image, and the reputation of Spain changed and evolved among politicians, revolutionary leaders, and everyday people? I'd like to start this section by highlighting an important and very symbolic and fascinating event that occurred on October 8th, 2019, and the debate that ensued afterwards. Next slide. On that day, descendants of the Spanish conquistador Hernán Cortés, an Aztec emperor, 16 generations, and the Aztec emperor Montezuma, 16 generations separated from their ancestors. They met in Mexico City to commemorate the 500th anniversary of the conquest of Mexico. The meeting was initially held at the Hospital de Jesús, which is the hospital that Hernán Cortés had founded where he's supposedly buried and has maybe one of the only busts of Hernan Cortés in Mexico. I'm not sure about that, but it's possible. On that day, Federico Acosta, who traces his lineage back 16 Federico Acosta is the person on the left here, who traces his lineage back 16 generations to Montezuma's daughter, embraced Ascanio Pignatelli, who is from Italy and who traces his lineage back 16 generations to the daughter of Hernan Cortés. During the meeting, Pignatelli apologized and asked for forgiveness for the, quote, bad things that took place during the conquest, urging the need to, quote, leave the past behind us. It was a cathartic event, and it was a cathartic because it wasn't dwelling on the past as much as it was looking towards the future. But interestingly, Acosta, the descendant of Montezuma, rejected the need for an official apology, noting that Mexico is Spain's family and Spain is Mexico's family. He said, en la familia, cuando nos conciliamos, nos damos la mano, y allí quedó eso. Esto es lo que somos, una familia. México es familia de España y España de México. No hay que pedir perdón de nada, es generar una diferencia que no existe. Lo que ocurrió, ocurrió. Hoy en día los mexicanos somos resultado de este mestizaje. And so I'll translate that. Within families, when we reconcile, we shake hands, and that's that. That's what we are, a family. Mexico is family with Spain and Spain with Mexico. There is no need to ask for forgiveness. This is to generate a difference without distinction. What happened, happened. Today, us Mexicanos are the product of this racial mixture. Even President López Obrador noted at the time in the future, he noted at the time that as brothers, Spain and Mexico could reconcile their history. But López Obrador also stated, I still like to ask the King of Spain and the Pope Francis humbly that they apologize for the abuses committed during the conquest and the colonial domination. Next slide. Joseph Borrell, Spanish foreign minister, refused to apologize. The Pope, however, who had already apologized on a prior visit to Bolivia in 2015, he did apologize on Mexican Independence Day in 2021 and noted that the anniversary of 500 years after the conquest, quote, necessarily includes a process of purifying memory, that is, recognizing the very painful errors committed in the past. Interestingly, Nicolás Maduro, president of Venezuela, also had asked for an apology from Spain, but he wanted reparations as well, which is interesting. I'll kind of get into that maybe a little bit later. Isabel Díaz Ayuso, however, touted as the possible future leader of Spain's conservative political party, rejected the Pope's apology, which had been given on behalf of Spain. She stated, quote, a Catholic who speaks Spanish should not talk that way about a legacy such as ours, which actually took Spanish and through the religious mission, Catholicism, and therefore civilization and freedom to the American continent. 2 days earlier, Ayuso had also had attacked populist indigenous movements across Latin America, saying that they were promoting, quote, a simplistic revision of Spanish history and trying to, quote, wreck the Spanish legacy in the Americas. She said that Spain's legacy in the America was, quote, one of the greatest landmarks in history. And she accused Mexico's president and other regional leaders of promoting an indigenism that was the new communism. Iván Espinosa de los Monteros, spokesperson for the far-right Vox's parliamentary group in Congress, also noted, I do not quite understand what a Pope of Argentine nationality is doing apologizing on the behalf of others, end quote. Representatives from this same party also praised Spain for succeeding, quote, in liberating millions of people from the bloody regime and terror of the Aztecs, end quote. So some of these debates, some of these arguments that are being made in 2021 are very similar to those that were being made in the 1890s and 1900. But this was a very different response than Spain's socialist-led government, which stated that, quote, the arrival of the Spanish on Mexican soil 500 years ago cannot be judged in light of contemporary considerations. So here again is this presentist argument. In the debates that took place in New Mexico over the removal of statues of conquistadores, the argument of presentism was one of the favorite arguments by the community members who wanted the statues to remain. Again, one of the things that I want to do in this work is to identify the ways in which people, intellectuals, community members, politicians, etc., are framing this debate, the facts, the documents, the arguments that they use or that they don't use, and the rhetorical and emotional styles that they implement to make their arguments. I kind of want to investigate all that and kind of extrapolate that and pick that stuff apart. But after the controversy that the letter of apology by Pope Francis to Mexico generated, mostly among right-wing politicians in Spain, Bishop Luis Arguello, Secretary General of the Spanish Episcopal Conference, entered the debate. For him and for the religious leaders of Spain, the controversy over the Pope's apology was not worth the commotion it was generating. Since, as he noted, the letter that the Pope sent to Mexico was not an apology for the Spanish conquest itself, but for the way the Catholic Church treated some indigenous peoples during the process. Indeed, Pope Francis had previously expressed his support of the evangelization of America many times, including in 2015 when he canonized Spanish Franciscan Junipero Serra during his visit to the United States. Bishop Arguello noted that, quote, "We have witnessed comments that we think have been made in response to a headline without reading the document itself. It's not a long document, it's one page, and it's addressed to the Church of Mexico because it celebrates the 200th anniversary of its independence. Outside that context, the document is not understood," end quote. Here the bishop is making a case for context and understanding, the context in which this letter was written, and admonishing those who read only headlines without delving deeper into the context. I haven't done the research here yet, but my goal is to look at how the indigenous communities in Mexico received this letter from the Pope and what Chicano intellectuals may have said about this, if anything, as well. More intriguing to me, however, is what Chicanos said about the comments made by Acosta, the descendant of Montezuma. I'm really interested to hear what they said about that, what indigenous peoples in Mexico said about that, their response to that. This is the question that really intrigues me. Next slide. A more complicated, however, and nuanced position on the Spanish legacy comes from Tlaxcala. Tlaxcalans who aided the Spanish in conquering the Aztecs and who benefited to some extent from the conquest. For instance, Spaniards married into the local nobility. Tlaxcala received special status in the Spanish colonial period with forms of self-rule. And its residents received the right to settle other parts of the colony. Today, Tlaxcalans, they suffer the label of traitors to the Mexican nation. They've been seen this way since the early part of the 19th century, and this label was cast on them in the wake of Mexican independence in the 1820s. And from then to now, the Mexican nation has created this kind of national mythology of them as traitors. But for them, Spaniards were liberators, right? They liberated them from the oppression of the Mexica, who exacted harsh tribute from them in the form of goods and sacrificial victims. It would have been nearly impossible for the Spanish to conquer the Mexica without the help of the Tlaxcalans. So this negative view of the Tlaxcalans, however, is currently being revisited by many scholars who now see the ways in which national heroes and villains are made, and often without the proper context. In any case, I'm trying to reconstruct this entire debate that I've been talking about in one chapter. Let's see here. So the Spanish legacy, however, next slide, has also been used by politicians and revolutionaries when it has been historically, or when it has historically suited their aims. So while some intellectual and political figures, such as Argentina's Domingo Faustino Sarmiento, disparaged Spain in an effort to start anew, right, to free itself from the backward shadow of this imperial monster, others used Spain and its connection to the global empire, or to a global empire, to fight against American imperialism. This was the case for Pedro Albizu Campos. Pedro Albizu Campos, many people in the audience may be familiar with him, was a Harvard-educated lawyer and president of the Puerto Rican Nationalist Party. He was a mulatto who artfully manipulated Puerto Rico's historical ties with Spain by regularly making reference to Spain as the progenitor of Puerto Rico's unique culture and civilizational worldview. He made frequent mentions of Puerto Ricans as belonging to La Raza, which for him constituted the entire Hispanic world. and which correspondingly mirrored Vasconcelos's raza cósmica. Through constant use of terms such as la raza, la madre patria, he endeavored to accustom the Puerto Rican consciousness to the notion of racial largesse and Hispanic cultural grandeur in an attempt to follow or to allow Puerto Ricanos to feel superior to North Americans and therefore worthy of political independence. In his El Día de la Raza speech given on October 12, 1933, Albizu Campos fully encapsulated the ideas of Hispanidad inherited through the militant Catholicism of Jaime Balmes, who was a Catalan cleric and whom he encountered while he was at Harvard. In this speech, Pedro Albizu Campos defined two historical events that defined the Puerto Rican character. The first was the Grito of Lares, September 23, 1868, which was the first time that in Puerto Rican history, when the independent nature of Puerto Ricans came to the fore, and the protracted dream of eventual sovereignty was proclaimed on that day. The other was October 12, 1492, El Día de la Raza, which was the day of the discovery of America, and for Albizu Campos, the nexus of Hispanic civilizational worldview. In this speech, Albizu Campos, much like Jose Vasconcelos, identified the unity of the three races in America, Black, Indian, and white. He believed that they made up the essential configuration of the Hispanic world and subsequently allowed Hispanics to claim racial authenticity. He stated, for instance, quote, "This is why, ladies and gentlemen, we celebrate the Day of the Race. And which are the Latin American nations? And which are the Latin American nations, the Hispanic countries? Here are their flags. Here is a symbol of the mother nation, Spain. The only occasion, ladies and gentlemen, on which we raise this flag, a flag not exclusively belonging to our nation, is on the day of the race. But these flags are ours. The Spanish flag is ours. The flag of Colombia is ours. The flag of Haiti is ours. The Dominican flag is ours. The Cuban flag is ours. And here they are, ladies and gentlemen, the flags, symbols of our greatness. Here is the Argentine flag, and the Cuban flag, and the Haitian flag, the Brazilian flag. These are the Latin American nations, the nations that form the core of civilization in America. Great is the grandeur of these nations, for great is the civilization of these nations. Barbaric nations, and in this case, he's referring to the United States, barbaric nations cannot contribute anything to those nations, not even in material riches. So this statement clearly illustrated the place of Spain in the panoply of Latin American nations as the mother, la madre patria, but not for Albizu Campos superior to her daughter republics. They were equal in this sense. This speech also highlights an important element in the Spanish legacy, which I won't discuss here, but which I'll take up in a good segment of the chapter, and maybe a full chapter, is the idea of unity among Latin American nations. This idea of unity has been one that's been touted all the way back to Simón Bolívar, and even currently with notions of Latino and Latinx, this idea of unity and what that means. In this same speech, he stated, "Ladies and gentlemen, we remember the mother country, Spain. And Spain, ladies and gentlemen, is one of the few nations that has always been civilized. Listen, barbarity never dominated Spain. Barbarity never dominated Italy. Barbarity never dominated Greece. Our Greco-Latin civilization comes from Greece, Italy, and Spain, from three mother peninsulas, which are Western civilization." Again, what he wanted to do here was connect his small and politically weak nation of Puerto Rico to the culturally powerful civilization of the West, in order that it might fight, as part of a Hispanic or the Latin world, fight against US imperialism. For him, the native Taino indigenous culture of Puerto Rico couldn't stand toe-to-toe with the United States, but the Western Hispanic world could. He wanted Puerto Ricans to feel like they were part of the grandeur of this world. Again, here he made the distinction between the civilized Latin nations, tacitly and at times overtly, implying that they were therefore superior to the Anglo-Protestant nations. And again, this comes from Jaime Balmes. The influence is clear from Jaime Balmes. And doing this, he conjured up the images of La Reconquista, believing that the United States symbolized the new Moors. He continued, quote, "We honor Spain's name because for us it means the science of law, the positive sciences, the sciences of the Christian and moral tradition in our nation. we are not confused by the fact that the Moors, in this case, the Moors are Anglo-Americans, have entered the temple of Christianity in Puerto Rico. We shall restore the temple, the Christian church, which has been violated in Puerto Rico, right here and now. Our time starts. Let's not abandon our nation to those who are oblivious to the great civilization that shapes our blood. Let's rescue, as the Spaniards rescued the Iberian Peninsula, our lands from profane hands. Puerto Rico has to start by pulling the economic, political, and cultural invasion out by the roots. So in utilizing Spain and the Spanish legacy to suit one's own ideological pretensions or political visions, you had men like Pedro Albizu Campos. You had Anglos in the Southwest who used the Spanish legacy strategically and financially, politically, or militarily for tourism dollars, or as a form of architectural revivalism. John Nieto Phillips talks about this in his phenomenal book in New Mexico. Chicanos, and this is the part that interests me the most, by the 1970s had rejected Spain in favor of indigenismo, following on the footsteps of Mexico, who after the Mexican Revolution had made indigenismo its official ideology. So in this section, I'm interested in untangling this complex mix of ideas about Spain, how it was used politically, intellectually, and economically, and the reasons why this rhetoric was being used. And here I want to tell this story about how identity was constructed and the emotional connection people had to both real and imagined histories. Next slide. Finally, question 3. After the murder of George Floyd, there was a general reckoning about race and monuments in the US among Blacks and whites, but Hispanics too were deeply engaged in our own reckoning with the past, specifically the Spanish past. There's been attempts all over the Southwest to remove statues of conquistadores, missionaries, settlers, to rename names of schools and buildings and street signs. But the question then was for me was this: if venerating Spain or venerating Spanish conquistadores, missionaries, and settlers is the wrong way to venerate the Spanish past, what then is the right way? How do we move forward with this, as I mentioned earlier, this problematic part of our past? Next slide. In this last section, I want to look at new ways in which contemporary scholars and communities are trying to deal with the Spanish legacy, especially the legacy left by conquistadores and settlers. So I identified 3 areas here: academia, the community, and the imaginary. In an interview with the Spanish newspaper La Nación in August 1906, Miguel de Unamuno, very revered Spanish intellectual, wrote that the United States is today the nation in which things of Spain are studied most and best. All of the great universities, he wrote, offer courses in Spanish language and literature, and these courses are becoming more and more popular. The number of young people dedicated to the study of our culture, Cosas de España, grows every year, end quote. Stemming from that statement, in the final section of the book, I want to trace the evolution of that change over the past century. I want to see, for example, how contemporary history and literature programs across the country, but mostly Chicano studies programs, how they study Spain, and more importantly, in what context. That's on the intellectual front. In terms of community-facing scholarship, several scholars and community leaders have vociferously proclaimed their desire to remove monuments to the celebration of Spain, particularly those that celebrate conquistadores and even missionaries. This is a highly contentious topic, one that needs more discussion and debate. Next slide. But one scholar, Esteban Rael Galvez, is doing some great work on indigenous history. He recently gave a talk here, a phenomenal talk here at UTEP a couple of days ago, about his new initiative to bring to light new stories of indigenous slavery. Really great stuff. But one of the controversial statues, the statue of Oñate, which we have one outside the airport. Can you go back to the previous slide? We have one right outside of our airport. The one on the right is the one that's right outside of the El Paso airport. The one on the left is in New Mexico. But Galvez notes that the fact that Oñate and other figures of conquest have been embraced as the symbol of identity reveals a lack of critical thinking and imagination. We are not static museum pieces, and history has never stood still like these statues. Working to recover a more profound sense of identity, I have called upon us to begin recognizing true icons of identity. If you can go back to the next slide. The true icons of identity being the mayordomos, the protectors of water, curanderas, protectors of health, farmers, stewards of the land, all of which reflect more deeply and meaningfully the essence of a living community, end quote. I think this may be a persuasive argument. I like it, but I think it needs to be developed further. Those who already dislike the monuments to conquistadores will most likely embrace these community symbols, which I think are great. But I'm not sure that they will convince those who embrace the Spanish past. I don't know if it satisfies our desire for the heroic. Maybe it does, I don't know. These founding stories about greatness stemming from scholars like Joseph Campbell frame the contours of the human imagination. And I want to research that more. Is what, as people, and this kind of is going to require me to delve into the field of psychology, which I don't really want to do, but maybe I'll have to kind of look at this question. Do people need heroes? And if so, how do you engage with that process? And then lastly, I want to look at the imaginary, namely how we tell this story, right? The storytelling process. What are the limits of telling this story? What are the expectations of a particular story of a moral? Is there a moral outcome? Is a particular or moral outcome that there's an expectation of, especially if it impacts the identities of others? So how do we tell this story? How does it challenge the status quo? And here I think it's going to really require myself particularly, since I'm writing this, it's going to require me to become a very proficient, at the very least, storyteller, to tell the story about our troubled past and about how we move forward. Next slide. And that's all I have. Thank you very much.
Wow, that was really terrific and made me think of a million questions.
Oh, great.
Yeah, wow, that was yeah, I wish I were in your classes. That's all I'm gonna say. I haven't been in classes for a long time, but I wish I were in your classes. So that was really great. Well, we already have some questions. I have some questions too, but I'm going to go straight to our questions. One of them is, how do you interpret the fact that many Latin American countries invite the King of Spain to presidential inaugurations?
That's a phenomenal question. How do I interpret that they invite the King of Spain? I don't know.
Yeah.
I do believe that many Latin American nations still hold on to this notion of hispanismo, of hispanidad, of wanting to reconnect back to Spain, of acknowledging that so much of their identity is tied in with Spain. I think it's a political move. I think in many ways it's kind of legitimizing their connection to again, something that Abisu Campos was trying to do to the Hispanic world, to give their people a sense of grandeur. We belong to this once grand Hispanic civilization, but we still belong to it spiritually and emotionally. I don't know exactly why they're doing that, but I would venture to say that it's a combination of politics and maybe catering to the public in a way that gives them a sense of grandeur. But it's something that's interesting, and I think I might look into that further.
All right, thank you. Here's another question. How do we help conversations on these topics that are happening right now to become more nuanced, given that most people are not historians or are not doing the kind of research that you're doing? So how do we have conversations today, basically, around these topics? Because they can get really heated, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, that's the thing. These topics can be very emotional, and they should be. I mean, these are very emotional topics, and when you start talking about issues of identity and how these things affect their identity, people's identities, it's an emotional topic. And given the fact that there's so much to it, there's such a long history, intellectual history to it, political history to it. Sometimes people just jump to the things that they see, the statue, the violence, the death, and they focus on that, and without going any deeper into the complexity of this issue. I don't know exactly how we facilitate that. I think we have to just, I'll go back to what I said earlier. We have to become good storytellers and tell a story that is, I don't want to say simple enough, that's accessible to people, but that also extrapolates the complexity and the nuances of this troubled legacy. I don't know how you do that. And that's partly what I'm trying to do in the book, is trying to figure out a roadmap for how we can do that. In fact, as I mentioned in the final chapter of the book, that's something I want to do. I want to lay out a roadmap for how we can accomplish that task, how we can talk about this legacy, this part of our identity as Hispanos, as Latinos, in a way that is balanced, in a way that acknowledges indigenous suffering, because that is there. We can't deny that. That's there. How do we acknowledge that at the same time as we acknowledge that the Spanish legacy is part of who we are? Speak Spanish, the Catholic religion. There's a connection there with Spain. Rejecting it, avoiding it, forgetting it, I don't think is a solution. We have to engage it head on, even if it's a little bit or a lot traumatizing or impactful. We have to do it. It's a conversation we have to have, and that's why I'm writing this book, because I think it's a conversation we have to have. And hopefully, in the final chapter, I can lay out a roadmap for how we can have that conversation in the intellectual sphere, but also with the community. So one of the things I don't want to do for the book is I don't want to make it too jargon laden. I don't want to make it too complicated. I want people to be able to access it and read it and understand it and engage with the ideas are complex, but there's no need to have complex language to if you're a good storyteller, you can tell that story.
Yes. Oh, so that is like my mantra, right? Because we want to write for the fullest and largest communities that we can. So
absolutely.
I did want to tell you have there's a statement here, bro, write the book, please, in all caps. So I wanted you to know that. Here's another question. This is sometimes you get these hard questions, so I'm curious about your thoughts on this. How do you feel about the term Latinx with regard to its political correctness? And that's by one of our attendees.
Yeah, that's a difficult one because, again, there's a division between the term Latinx, the way it's used by scholars and academics, and Latinx in the way it's used by the community. And there was a recent Pew poll that came out recently saying that, most people in the community don't like the term Latinx. Only 3% of the population uses the term Latinx. I don't know how to engage with that complex issue. It's not just Latinx anymore, because it's now Chicanx. It's now I've even seen Hispanics. There's an X after all these monikers, and I don't know that it's necessary to deal with it. I think it's part of the way the language is evolving, and I don't think it takes away or adds. It doesn't take away anything from the discussion of the Spanish legacy, I don't think. So I'll bring it up in the book, and as you saw in one of the slides earlier in the 1990s and 2000s, you had growing up Latinx, growing up Latino, and the most recent one, which was from 2022, I believe, was growing up Latinx. So that's the new kind of. I just think it's just the way the language is evolving, at least in the academic sphere. Amongst the community, I think it's going to be a larger battle to kind of have acceptance of that term. But I don't think the term itself takes away from having a full-blown discussion of the Spanish legacy.
Thank you. Here's again, please, folks, if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A. I have a question, and that is, so you're doing all of this work that you do right on the border of the U.S. and you're in El Paso, and I guess I'm curious. I mean, you have like such diversity of thought in the area as well, with regard to a lot of the things that you were talking about, and I loved how you talked about how you included all of the student voices at the beginning. I thought that was really, really interesting, just kind of really looking at them as experts, right? Because I think we should do that more often.
Yeah.
So I guess I'm just curious, how does place and where you are situated in terms of your academic job, how is that having an impact on this research? And do you ever feel, because of where you're located, like pressured one way or the other, or is there like a general feeling around some of these issues in where you're located that might be similar to how you construct this as a historian, or vastly different? I just kept thinking about that.
Yeah, that's a complicated thing to engage with. First of all, on the border with my students, everybody's familiar with these notions. So it's easy to talk about it, and it's easy to elicit opinions and perspective. Everybody has a perspective on the Spanish legacy. And it's interesting, one of the things that I've noticed is that you have this class element to it, as I mentioned earlier, when you have kind of upper class people or people from the middle and upper classes who don't have a problem with the Spanish legacy or embrace the Spanish legacy. And you have more people who are in the lower classes who reject it. Chicanos, for instance, really reject the Spanish legacy. But everybody has an opinion on the border, and I think that's great. I think at some point, I'd like to separate myself outside of the borderlands, and hopefully I can get a writing fellowship or something to be outside and see it from the outside in, because I'm in it currently, and I see all these perspectives and I'm engaging with them, and it's great because it's fuel. But at some point, I'd like to step back and see it from the outside in. In terms of how this debate is being framed in academia, at least, there is in academia, at least, a great deal of antagonism towards the Spanish legacy. It's really difficult to engage with the Spanish legacy in a balanced way, because there is an expectation that Spain was the colonizer. It colonized, it conquered, it did all these bad things, and we have to focus on that. And that's not untrue. That is very true. But I think there's a point in which we have to step away from that and kind of see things in context and see the nuances that are involved. And in academia, that can be a bit difficult, a bit tricky to engage with. As I mentioned, there's a lot of great stuff being done on indigenous history, indigenous borderlands, indigenous slavery, the indigenous mentality, really great stuff. And so the trend is headed in that direction. As some of my colleagues told me, what you're doing isn't really cutting edge, but I feel like it is. I feel like it is because I'm trying to find a place in the middle where we can have this conversation and not choose a side. Like my students said, there's no need to choose a side. Look at the research, look at the facts, look at the scholarship, and tell a story without having to choose a side. I think that's what I'm trying to do. It can be difficult because, again, you have different sides and different perspectives, and some of these sides are they're entrenched in their perspective, and they have a hard time accepting or even acknowledging the opposing side on both sides, and so it becomes difficult. But that's why I think this book is challenging, but that's also why I want to write this book.
Yeah, when you're talking about stepping away and out of the environment, I think that's just so interesting to do as a scholar too, because sometimes when we're deep in the midst of things, it's and I also just want to go back to what you said about terminology and how it's used in communities and how it's used in academic communities, right? Sometimes I think as academics, we really do need to step away from we need to step away from the academy and talk with people in communities, because sometimes we're just speaking we're speaking to each other, right, instead of really engaging the larger community, or multitude of communities. So I appreciate you talking about that. Another question that I wanted to ask is, so do you think by kind of switching up the way that you are teaching and getting students to grapple with some of these issues, Do you think that you'll inspire students to maybe pursue these kinds of scholarly agendas or academic careers? Or I was thinking about that as you were talking as well. Just wondering.
I hope so. I mean, that's always the hope, to inspire my students to really, to be deep thinkers. In my classes, I try to get away from students thinking about grades. Stop thinking about grades, stop worrying about an A or B or C, and just sit down and think about the issues in a deep and meaningful, in a comprehensive way. So I think, and I've talked about this in my undergraduate class quite a bit this semester. I told them I was giving this talk, and it was going to be a difficult talk because I had to really kind of focus on this and that, and I asked them, your responses to the prompt that I had submitted. I'd like to use some of those, so I asked them permission for that, and they were excited about that. I think so. I think, talking about these issues and then talking about it in a way that I'm trying to get deep and into the topic, I think it inspires them, because they see that history is not just on the surface. It's really deep, and to get there, you have to put in the work, and there's a lot of work that goes into it. And I think, I think it inspires them to that extent. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Great. Okay. So another comment, it would be good if your book can help us to see what elements of the Latin American and Hispanic idiosyncrasies are inherited from Spain and what comes from our indigenous African ancestors. As a Latin American, I reject the Spanish legacy because I feel we inherited elements from the colonization that have impaired our progress as independent nations. I would like your book to perhaps clarify this. Any comments?
Yeah, well, that's what a lot of intellectuals in the 19th century were saying after independence, was that the reason that Latin America is so backwards is because of the Spanish legacy, the Spanish language, the Spanish culture, all these different things. There is an element of what the question asked, which is absolutely true. There is an imperial colonial legacy that has held a lot of Latin American countries back. But I don't know that rejecting the Spanish legacy is the right way to move forward. I think, as Vasconcelos said, as Albizu Campos said, there is a combination of African, of indigenous, and Spanish blood and ideas and contributions and culture that come together. And it's that space that I want to focus on. So I think the question is well put. I think it's an interesting question, but I want to kind of go beyond that and kind of find spaces where the three cultures can come together and talk about the Spanish legacy within that frame.
Thank you. Thank you. All right, we got more questions. Do you know how Spain teaches their history of the conquest? What do they tell their children? I'm thinking K through 12 students. Is it glossed over in detail? I wonder. That's the question.
That's a phenomenal question. I don't know the answer to that. I'd have to, and that's something I want to do. I want to, for the last portion of the book, the intellectual portion, I want to look at textbooks. I want to look at Chicano studies programs in the US. But I also want to look at how it's being taught in Mexico. And the person mentioned who just gave the question is absolutely right, how it's being taught in Spain. Because you still have a lot of monuments in Spain that glorify the Spanish conquest. There's monuments to Pizarro. I think in Trujillo, there's a monument to Pizarro. There's homes, big mansions in the north of Spain that are commemorations to the wealth that was extracted from the wealth of the Americas. How is that talked about in the schools? I think it's a great question. I don't have an answer to that, but I think it's a great question that I'm definitely going to look into for sure.
All right. Here's another one. Can you define identity as you've used it in your talk? Self-identity as well, a combination objective and emotional, or only emotional? Is it a combination of objective and emotional, or only emotional? So can you define identity as you've used it in your talk, and also self-identity? And then is it a combination of objective and emotional, or only emotional?
This is the question that terrifies me the most,
Oh no.
because I don't know how to answer that. I have no clue. When it comes to issues of identity, I don't know how to address this topic. A lot of it is self-identity, but there's going to be a point in which I want to have to separate self-identity from historical identity. I don't understand the emotional part. I don't know how to engage the emotional part of that. But yeah, this is the part that terrifies me the most, is the issue of identity. It's one that I have to address. Again, if I want to get back to the Chicanos in the 21st century, I have to address the issue of identity. But I'm still struggling, and I'm still trying to figure out how to deal with. Again, I'm a colonial Latin American historian, so all this stuff is outside my wheelhouse. I wanted to engage with it because it's something I've always wanted to do, but I realized as I was preparing the talk for today, I realized how complex it's going to be, and how many different areas of scholarship I'm going to have to become proficient in identity, and how scholars have looked at identity and how they talk about identity. That's one of them, and I don't really know a whole lot about what scholars have done in terms of academic work on identity. But I'm going to have to read all that stuff and figure out how to fit that into the framework that I'm using.
Thank you. All right, here's another one. A little off topic, but have you seen the PBS show Finding Your Roots, season 8, episode 5, Mexican Roots, in which they look into the histories of TV host Mario Lopez and comedian Melissa Villaseñor? They looked into their ancestors back to the 1500s. It's very good. So just wondering if you've seen that.
I have not, but I'm definitely going to check it out now.
Okay. Yes. All right. Great. Well, if there are any more questions, please send them in. And I guess just one last thing that I wanted to ask is, when do you think this book will be done? And what are you thinking in terms of a timeline, so we can have you come back and give a book talk?
I would love to do that. Give me 3 years.
Okay.
as I mentioned, I'm riding that wave right now. Everything I'm doing is oriented towards the book, the courses that I'm teaching, the books that I'm assigning, and so I want to get this done in the next 3 years. I don't want to go past that, maybe 4, but not past that. But I think this is the right time for this book. Like I said, I've been wanting to write this book for a very long time. I just had no idea, no clue how to start it, how to engage it. But I think I have an idea now, and it's going to change over the course of the next 2-3 years. But whatever, 2022, 20 and 25, 26, you can have me back and I'll give the book talk for sure.
All right. I love that. And it's also good for people, especially if there are any students who are on here, because sometimes, people assume that writing a book, it doesn't take very long. And, people always say to me, oh, you always have a new book out. And I'm like, well, that's because I've been working on it for like 5 years. So it's really important for people to understand just how long it takes. And I just wanted you to know people are saying they're really looking forward to the book. And so am I. I'm really looking forward to that. And my offer to do a book talk with you stands. So we would love to have you do that. So great. I just want to say, first of all, thank you so much, Ignacio, for joining us today and giving just a great presentation. And I wanted to just reiterate something that you said, which is the clarity about the work that you do. And what I loved about this presentation is that I felt like really anybody could learn from it. And it was just, I don't know, the clarity really resonated with me. So thank you. I mean, this is not a topic that I know that much about, but I was completely able to follow it the entire time, and to really feel like I was learning a lot, and also to make a lot of connections with things that I'm seeing all around me. So I wanted to say thank you for that. And I have seen that statue at the El Paso airport many times and wondered about it, so thank you so much for joining us today. I wanted to say thank you to all of the people who joined us. Thanks for taking some time out of your day to be with us and to be with Ignacio. And I hope that you'll follow his career. Like I said, I've known him since 2015, and he's just an amazing scholar doing really, really great work. I also want to say thanks to the Proctor Institute and Center for Minority Serving Institutions staff who helps us to make all of this possible, to the Mellon Foundation for sponsoring this event. And yeah, just enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks for being with us, and keep up the good work, and good luck on the book, Ignacio. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Mary Beth. Thank you.
Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.